We are back with another episode of Truth Over the Noise. I am one of your hosts, Trey Cochran, and with me, as always, is one of my best friends in the whole wide world, Mr. Nathan Woltmann. He and I have known each other for a couple of years now. We've gone through a lot together through small group and through our church. And today is very special because you heard my testimony last week. This week, we get to hear Mr. Woltmann's testimony. I am excited about this. I hope you all are too. And this is just going to be a great day. So, Mr. Woltmann, if you please.
Absolutely, Trey. Thank you so much for that introduction here for this third episode of Truth Over the Noise. And yes, today is my testimony. And just like you would have heard Trey's testimony, and what a powerful testimony his was. But this week is mine. And so, I want to say this before we go any further. We kind of mentioned it in the introduction. And I think Trey may have mentioned it last episode, but the purpose of our testimony and why we're even giving this is for you, our listeners, to understand that we are human. We have made mistakes. We've had a past. We've had things in our lives that we regret, we don't like to do, we didn't want to do. Now that we look back at it, and it's what makes us human. It's what makes us, why the grace of God and the mercy of God is so important to us, and that we want to be able to give that back to you and to explain that, no matter what you've done in your life, God is still merciful, He is still gracious, and for every moment that you have on this earth that you have breath, that is grace and mercy that God is giving you, because He still has a purpose, He still has a reason why you're here. So, with that, let's get right into my testimony. So first off, my name is Nathan Woltmann, and I am the network director of TIO Radio Network. But I didn't get here at this moment doing what I'm doing right now without my past. And so let's go back to the past and let's talk about that. So I was first born of my parents, Daniel Woltmann and Melissa Woltmann. I was born many, many moons ago in the 90s. And I was born both. My dad was an evangelist. My mother was a teacher at heart, and both of which, by the way, my dad grew up actually in a Christian teacher's home. His parents were teachers, and my mom grew up. Her father was a war vet and also a factory worker after the wars. And so I've had a very rich heritage when it comes to both sides of my family and whatnot. And I grew up in that type of environment, with my dad being an evangelist and everything. And it's not about him. I'm not going into his testimony, but I grew up in situations where we were going into churches, and his job was to help revitalize and to help grow churches. And so part of where I grew up in is I went to these different churches and I went to these different places and seen the worst. Like, I've been into different situations where churches were falling apart at its seams, and so when I say I've seen it, and I've seen it all that can be done in a church, I have. And sometimes it wasn't a good thing, especially at a young age and a young impressionable age. It just wasn't something that I would recommend for most people growing up. But I think looking back at that, though, that really gave me the foundation of where I am at today. But my testimony really begins all the way back at the age of 4. I remember the day, and I remember it was April 27th, 1997. I was 4 years old. It was just before my 5th birthday. And I remember we were at our apartment. We had just moved in, probably not a few months earlier. And again, as a 4-year-old and now being in my 30s, it is a little difficult remembering the exact conversation that was had. But I do remember nonetheless asking, about being saved. I was asking my dad to say, hey, what does it mean to have Jesus in my heart? And so my dad there at the kitchen table led me to the Lord. And I still distinctly remember that day being the day that I accepted Christ as my Savior. Now, as I'm going to explain later in my testimony, there has been more times than I can count on my hand as to doubting my salvation. But I'm going to go into that later. But I know now more than ever that was the day that I said, God, I can't do this on my own, and I need you. Even all the way back at a 4-year-old, as a faith like a child, I came before Jesus and I said, Jesus, I need you in my heart. So I know that that was the day that God entered his Holy Spirit in my life, and that was the beginning of my really new life going forward. But of course, in my case, a lot of falling away throughout my life. In fact, a lot of embarrassing times that I'm about to reveal to a lot of people that I've never talked about before. In fact, a lot of what I'm going to say here, I would have to say there's probably less than 5 people that I know of that knows my full story. And today, there's going to be a lot more of you that are going to get to know that. But let's start at the beginning again. So I'm 4 years old, I'm saved. At 5, went off to kindergarten, went to a Christian school that just had a kindergarten at the time. And that was where kind of the first social interactions that I had, besides church and being in the nursery type thing, was there at that kindergarten. Got into so much trouble. But I remember the first day of school was I showed up and my teacher, Miss Huffine, and poor Miss Huffine, I bless her heart. She's with the Lord now, and I look forward to seeing her one day again. But Miss Huffine was, she told me to go, I think something to write up on the board, the chalkboard. And I didn't want to do it. So I picked up my pencil and I threw it at her. What happened after that is pretty self-explanatory. It was a phone call to my parents, they pick up at the school, and some grounding, and as well as some grounding on the what we call the tushy. There was a little bit of some spankings there, and well-deserved, by the way, well-deserved spankings for that. And needless to say, I didn't have that problem much more after that in kindergarten. First grade rolled around, and I started homeschooling. We did homeschooling through Abeka Books. But Abeka Books, by the way, did that for 12 years. So from first grade to 12th grade, I did Abeka Books video school. And as I said in the first episode, there's a lot of pros to homeschooling. 1, school, got out early. 2, honestly, I had more time to actually study the material and was able to take my own time at it. So that was great. I was able to learn a lot more there. Also, homeschooling gave us the flexibility to be able to travel. So my dad was an evangelist, again, as I said earlier, and he was able to travel from one location to another, and we were able to go with it. So I remember back in the early years of my life, in fact, from 96 is when I started first grade, all the way through 2001. So I would have been in 5th grade or 4th grade that year. I remember us traveling a lot, and we had the old VHS tapes. And if you don't know what VHS is, ask one of your older millennial, either parents or brother and sister. These were these little cassette tapes, these round boxes. Not trying to get into the weeds here, but basically, this VHS is what had all my school lessons on it. And each VHS had 2 days worth of school. So it had every lesson that I needed for elementary, from Bible, arithmetic, English, science, history, and I think we also had health and safety. I think that was our science class. But it was all encompassed in that, and it was 2 days worth of videos. And so you put it in, you hit play, and it played, and when the day was over, you stopped it, and then you would play the second day whenever it was time for that. And then at the end, you would rewind the video and put it back in the little case, and then after so many videos we had, we would ship them back, and they would give us another set. So that was my early years. But we have it hooked up in our van, and the van, it would hook up to the 12-volt car battery thing that was in there, the what used to be called a cigarette lighter, for those of you that are a little bit older and know what I'm talking about. But we'd plug it in there, and my dad had it rigged up to where I could watch it on a 5-inch black and white television, and that was my schooling. And and I have very fond memories of it. Now, granted, at the time I hated it. I thought this was the dumbest thing in the world. Why am I doing school on the road? We're going places. Why am I doing this? But looking back at it, that's had some of my most fondest memories of childhood, was us traveling and me doing school in the back of the van. So that was a little bit of fun there. But I remember those early years, though, from kindergarten all the way up through till middle school. Or through middle school. We were at this one church, though, in North Carolina. In fact, that's where I grew up most of my life, was in North Carolina. And at this church, all my friends were there. I had 3 best friends. And I don't know if I should mention their names here, but nonetheless, I'll leave it there. Maybe later on I'll mention who they are. But 3 best friends of mine growing up, and everything we do was together at church. Like, that's the only time that we ever really saw each other, because 2 of the ones were in public school, 1 was in a private school, and then I was obviously homeschooled. So the only time we ever saw each other was actually at church. And so every Sunday, every Wednesday night, man, we were the four horsemen. We were always together, always doing things, and always getting in trouble with each other. And I find that those were the years that I would consider to be my most innocent years. I mean, I had, as a child, children, you do things as children, that you weren't supposed to do. A ton of spankings, a lot of grounding, things of that nature. It happened a lot during those years, but those were the years that I find that I was learning a lot spiritually. We had a program, for those of you that may or may not know this program, it's called King's Kids. And it's similar to that of Awanas or Master Clubs, depending on which church you went to and what you had. It was similar to that, except I think the biggest fundamental difference between those, because I've been a part of, or I've seen what Awanas and Master Clubs does. The biggest difference is there wasn't so much of the badges and the awards and everything else. It was a lot of, most of the night was actually scripture memory time. So you would come in, we have a booklet, and on that booklet there would be 3 sections on each page. And each page, those 3 sections, they would usually contain a quote and then either 2 Bible verses that we had to memorize, or it would have some sort of like paragraph that wasn't necessarily a quote, but it was a reference to what was being said on that particular verse or whatever, and then verse. And we'd have those 3 sections that we'd have to memorize. And we can say one section at a time, but eventually, in order to move on to the next page, we had to be able to say everything on that page, memorized completely word for word without any help, and had to do that there. And I find that those were the years that I honestly believe that if it hadn't been for those years, that God had instilled in me those scriptures and had those put the Bible to my heart during those years. I don't think the following years that I'm going to go into here in a minute, I don't think they would have had the same turnout. I would not have been the same person. In fact, I probably wouldn't even be here right now telling you this story if those years were not so impactful. The people that were there at that church and the people that we were around, they had their faults too. There was a lot of issues there at that church, and I'm not going to, that's this episode nor any episode really is going to go into that. But I still look back at that, and if it hadn't have been for those people instilling the gospel and instilling God's word into my heart and into my life, and honestly, even with what I was learning through Abeka, and through Abeka books and what we were learning in Bible classes there and history and in science and all of those years, if they had not been where they were at those moments and at those times, the next several years, in fact, the next really 20 years, would never have been the same. So now we move forward. So now I'm in middle school, and as most people will tell you, middle school or junior high, depending on where you live. I know that's different. But for me, I grew up in a time where middle school, 6th through 8th grade was the thing. And so, or actually I got that backwards. Sorry, Georgia has middle school. Anyway, that's beside the point. That's not really the main thing. But in junior high, I should say, actually North Carolina was 7th and 8th grade. When I got into there, that's really your more, formative years when it comes to, you're being influenced a lot more, because at that age, you're starting to make decisions on your own. And it's being, I don't want to say conflicted, but it's being or manipulated, but I guess the combination of those two, conflicted and manipulated, in such a way where during those years, not only are you still being told what to do and how to do things, but you're also able to then at that point make decisions and say, hey, I'm either going to do this or I'm not, and then face the consequences of that. Unlike in elementary school, you're told to do something. If you didn't do it, the consequences were pretty immediate, and it was, you're getting a spanking. We told you to do this. You're going to do this. There's a reason, but you don't need to know the reason. You just need to do it. But at junior high, that's when you start getting into the age where we're going to explain a little bit more. We're going to tell you why we're doing this, because if you don't do this, or if you do this, the consequences of this is going to be bad. It's going to be, this. It was very important to have followed the rules and do those things, but now you're also at the age where, we're going to give you a little leeway. We're going to let you make some decisions and maybe to do things. Well, just like in Trey's testimony, I too was also caught up in the whole pornography situation, even at that age. And it was not a situation that I look back at and be like, if I could have gone back and done it again, I would. I would sit there and say, no, I don't want to do this. I would tell my younger self, just walk away. You don't need this in your life. And it started there, and it grew for many, many years. In fact, I struggled through that all the way through college. I had a lot of issues with that. I'm gonna get, when I get back toward the end of this, testimony, I want you to hold on to this part, okay? This is going to be key, because a lot of everything else that I ended up going through in life, a lot of it was affected because of this, okay? Because of the pornography and because of the issues that I had growing up with that. All right. But I don't want to delve so much into it that's all we talk about here, because that's not my entire testimony. That's not my entire life. It was a major aspect of it, but it wasn't the main thing. It influenced a lot of where I ended up being. But I'm going to come back to it at the end, because at the end of all of this, I'm going to be able to reflect back on something that is going to be key as to why I can sit here today and say, what I can say. So with that, I'm going to move on. So high school comes around. We move from North Carolina. We moved to Georgia in my 10th grade year, right? In fact, 9th grade, actually, because of what happened at the church, 9th grade, I actually had to go to a different church. Same area, in fact, just a few miles down the road. But I had to go to a different church and a different youth group, and it was different. 9th freshman year in high school, and all of a sudden, I've got none of my friends. I know nobody. And again, I was homeschooled, so my interactions were very, very small. So here I am going back to kind of almost having to start all over again, completely in a completely different environment. But I've never been through that before, because up until that point, my entire understanding of life and knowledge of people literally revolved around this one area and this one church that I had been in for now almost a decade at that point. So here we are, I'm at this new church. And I met some really good people. In fact, for this whole year, went to the youth group, and it really brought me out of my shell. There were some guys there that they gave me a nickname that, by the way, I'm not going to say here on the thing. If you want to ask me personally, I will be honest and tell you, but I won't do that here on the podcast. But the nickname that they gave me ended up becoming what later would be my gaming profile name. By the way, I'm a big video gamer. I love video games. I love sitting down and interacting and playing games with people. And it's almost to a fault in some cases. So kind of a thing I have to work on even now at the age of 30. But that's kind of how I got my social interactions with people, was through games and things like that. Because again, being homeschooled, didn't have a lot of opportunities other than church to hang out with people. But anyway, I digress on that. But they gave me a nickname for that, and it was a good name, and a lot of fond memories from that. In fact, this is the church that introduced me for the first time to Southern gospel music, which, if you listen to TIL radio, that is primarily what we play, is Southern gospel music. Now, you can define that however you want, but at least in the sense of, like, we do have different genres in there, but primarily it's Southern gospel music. Well, my initiation to Southern gospel music was actually at this church. It was on a Sunday night. In fact, it was Super Bowl Sunday night. And so that night they had brought in a group called the Ball Brothers. Now, at the time, no one knew who they were. Okay, this was 2006. They had no idea, or actually, it was 2006, 2007. 2007. It was the following year. Yeah, early 2007. They were just getting out onto the circuit, the Ball Brothers were. And this was actually one of their very first concerts that they were doing, was at this church in North Carolina. In fact, actually to this day, I've gotten to meet them a couple of times, and they actually remember that church, and they remember that night. They don't necessarily remember me, but that's okay. But they remember that night, so they know that I was there, and that was kind of a neat thing for later. But they were the ones that actually introduced me to Southern gospel music and how I got into that. Because up to that point, I was listening to either, what would be considered high church type music, where it was your piano, organ, old school hymns, which, by the way, I want to interject here on that as part of my testimony. I will defend hymns every single day. The doctrine that you find in hymns, the doctrine that you find that is in those hymns that were made all those years ago, are still better, in my opinion, today than any other music that is being written today. Yes, there's some great music being written today, but I'll digress on that, because we have a whole podcast episode coming up that's going to deal with that. But I remember, being introduced to that, and then afterwards we went and had a Super Bowl party, all the youth and everything. But that was where I got introduced to Southern gospel music. And at the time, I didn't really know that that's what I was into, but this was the beginning of how, even in spite of what I was doing behind the scenes with the pornography and everything else, God was already working in my life. And this was the very beginning of it. I honestly believe my 9th grade year and us having to leave the one church and go to this other church was the beginning of Him directing my life, even in spite of my own sin and my own wrongdoing. God's gracious. God's merciful. I cannot say that enough. that being said, moving forward, now we moved to Georgia. So that summer, literally right after that, in just a couple of months later in May, actually, as soon as I finished ninth grade, we moved to Georgia, where we are living now, actually here in LaGrange, Georgia, where TIL Radio is based out of. So we moved here when I was at the age of 15. And thankfully, though, we moved to a place and to a church where we kind of already knew the people there. So the pastor there, by the way, him and his wife, they actually went to college with my parents, so they knew each other. And prior to that, while we were still living in North Carolina, there was a couple of summers where we actually went to a church where they were the pastor of the church as well, there in North Carolina. We were going there and helping out their VBS that they would do each year. And so they had 3 sons in their family, and those 3 sons, again, won't mention their names, but if they happen to be listening to this, they know who I'm talking about. But the 4 of us really became really close friends back then. We were, good friends with each other, best friends in some regards. We had our moments like any other, young person with friends, but overall, I think I look back at it and say that it was a good childhood friendship that we had all those years ago. And so at least moving here, I knew some people, and it felt more comfortable with that. But the thing that led me further along with where God was leading me was where we moved to. The church that we went to also happened to have a radio station. Okay, and so that automatically is already going to start ringing bells with people who know who I am, at least a little bit. Me working in radio. I was in the 10th grade, and I was still being homeschooled. So I was homeschooled at the church. My mom was the secretary there, so she was working there at the church, and so I'd be in this other office, and I'd be working on schoolwork. Well, after I was done with schoolwork, after I was done with doing, the classwork and the homework and all that, I would scoot over to the radio station, just hang out. Now, let's be honest, I'd go over there. Most of the time it was just, I would do a few things. I'd put in some programs for the radio station. I would, I would learn a few things from the manager there and from the director of operations there. But both of them, by the way, were great. The general manager there, he considered me as one of his sons, because you have to understand, for him, he had 9 daughters. So when I would come over, it was like, oh, good, my son is here. So we got to hang out and do stuff. And then the other guy that was there, his name's David, by the way. I'll mention his name. He had a huge influence in my life. He's the whole reason why I even got into radio, even why I got into computers. In fact, just a little side note, it's something that's always fun to me. The computer that I'm actually recording this on and everything, I actually hand built this computer. And if it hadn't been for him, I would not have been able to do that. I would have probably just bought a computer, but I bought all the parts, I put together. He's the one that taught me how to do all that. And so, again, those 2 guys I look at probably the most influential in the sense of directing the very beginning of my path in life. Those 2 guys were the most instrumental in that. I believe God used them to guide me in such a way that got me to where I am now. And if it hadn't have been for those 2 guys pouring into me then, not just spiritually, although they did do that. In fact, David was, for a time, him and his wife were my youth pastors and youth leaders at the same church. But the 2 of them definitely, him and again, the general manager, Rick, the 2 of them poured so much into my life, and I'm truly honored to have been able to work with them as they taught me so many different things about radio and about life and about computers. I mean, those guys were definitely, I can't say that enough, the biggest influences in my life. Well, high school ends, and now I have to go off to college. And so I go, and actually, I'll tell you where I went. I went to college. I went to Pensacola Christian College. Same place, by the way, that Abeka comes from. So kind of ironic there in a way. But it was also, and I'll be honest with you, a lot of it had to do with, I did visit other colleges, other Christian colleges and whatnot. But the reason why I chose Pensacola was for 2 reasons. Actually, really 3 reasons. One, I did honestly, truly felt like that was where God was leading me. And looking back at it, I feel like that feeling was definitely real, because the people that I got to meet there and the influences that I got to meet there, they definitely influenced me in a lot of ways. And so I don't think I would have gotten that anywhere else. So number 1, God definitely directed me there. Number 2 is kind of because it was also the cheapest option. I mean, when I could go to college and only spend, I think it was like $10,000 a year, and that included all of my books, all of my fees, room, board, and tuition, the whole kit and caboodle, okay? For $10,000 a year, I couldn't pass it up, because there really wasn't any other college out there that was doing that. And I also had a scholarship with them to where if I did pay the full tuition price, room and board, the whole thing, for for 3 full years, my 4th year would be completely free. All I would have to pay for in my 4th year was the books, technically I think the room and board was also had to be paid for, things like that. So, so financially, that was the other reason why I chose there. But then third, it was also familiar, because I had been doing Abeka books and I had been doing, the schooling with Abeka. And so I was familiar with their education, their academics. I was familiar with how they tested, how they quizzed. I was familiar with several of the teachers who I had in my video classes for Abeka. But a lot of them, by the time I got to college, were now teaching in the college courses. So I was at least familiar with the teachers. I knew how to interact with them because I knew their personality by watching the videos. So there was a lot of familiarity with that. So good, bad, however you want to look at it, as those were the reasons nonetheless why I chose to go to Pensacola Christian College. But then I was like, what am I going to study? So up until that point, early on in my life, I'm going to cut back a little bit. Early on in my life, I wanted to be like my dad. I think most kids, they want to be, especially if you grew up in a good home, and I was blessed to grew up in a good home. I know a lot of people who may be listening to me, you didn't grow up in a good home. Maybe you could, relate with some of the other people that we're going to be bringing on, and I know with Trey's testimony there were some aspects of that in his testimony, so maybe you can relate with him a little bit more. But I can't lie. I grew up in a great home. I grew up with some great parents that loved me. They cared for me. They wanted the best for me. And so when I was looking at growing up, I wanted to be like my dad. I wanted to be like an evangelist. Obviously, knowing now what I know now about that, I know. I'm going to tell this to even some adults who think that they want to do what my dad does. I'm going to tell you right now, as a side note, you do not want to do what my dad does. I'm going to leave it at that, but I'm just telling you, there's a lot involved in that most people would just quit, okay? But I digress on that. I get back to my testimony, though, and that is that, I wanted to be like my dad, but then as I got into high school, there was a teacher by the name of Mr. McBride, okay? And Mr. McBride, by the way, was my favorite teacher, and he taught history. He taught Bible classes in high school level, and I just loved history, and I loved Bible, and I loved him. And he made education fun. He made it where when you went to class, you wanted to learn. He just had that personality about him, and so I wanted to do that. I wanted to be an education teacher. I wanted to be like him. So I showed up. I had, and by the way, ironically, when I showed up, he was my faculty advisor, Mr. McBride. So I was ecstatic. It was great. The greatest thing in the world, right? But I signed up earlier in my late my 12th grade year, but early on in the year, and I signed up to go to Pensacola, and I signed up to be secondary education teacher, emphasis in history, minor in Bible. That was my original major. Okay. Now, for those of you at this point are probably wondering, well, how did you go from that to where you are now? We're going to get there. Don't worry. Literally that day, that Saturday, I showed up. I was there on the Saturday early because I was also going to be a worker student. So all of us worker students that were working on campus, we had to show up the weekend before for orientation. But we also were there because that we also got to sign up for classes early. Everybody else couldn't do that until the Monday, which ironically classes started on Tuesday. So we got lucky to be able to sign up on classes, pick whatever classes we want early on, be able to work all that out. So I show up, I look at the catalog, and we're now looking at like the classes that I got to take, okay, for all the years, freshman, sophomore, junior, senior year, all that, okay? And I look at it, and I get to my sophomore and junior year. I just got to my sophomore year, and I looked at the classes, and there were so many writing classes, and I do not like writing, okay? I don't. In fact, reading and writing is the last thing I love to do. Don't get me wrong. If there's a good book, I will read it. Okay. Obviously I've read the Bible. I think I've read all of it at least once. I know I've got a couple of books that I haven't read in a long time, so I got to go back and read those. But I've read the Bible, and have done that. So, but on a secular level, I've read books before and stuff. And there's a couple of them, by the way, that I am very fond of. And I'll even mention here, my favorite book of all time, outside of the Bible, okay, which is, by the way, the truth. The Bible is my favorite book, but the other book that I will hands down, and I will continually, I have not found another book that has given me such thrill and exhilaration of like, what is going to happen next? Like, how did that happen? If you've ever read Agatha Christie, by the way, you probably have seen some movies about this recently. Murder on the Orient Express, The Death of the Nile, things like that. Those are books that she wrote, okay? But my favorite book, they've never done a movie about this, but at least not to my knowledge. But it was called And Then There Were None. And I actually read it for a book report that I did back in 7th grade, I think. And it is still to this day my favorite book, secular book of all time that I've ever read. And it's because it was the only book that I've ever read that I couldn't predict the end of the book. I'm usually pretty good at like reading, and I'll get about halfway through the book, and if there's a plot going on or if there's going to end up being a plot twist, even if I don't know the exact plot twist or know the exact details of how it's going to, I know generically speaking, like, okay, the book is going to end this way. Like it's going to end in this format. Okay. The good guy's going to win or the bad guy's going to win or whatever. I could pretty much tell you how that's going to be. This was the one book that I couldn't figure out. And in fact, it got to the point when I got to the end of the book, I actually went back a few chapters to read another chapter, which I don't want to spoil the book. If you've never read it, I highly recommend that you do. But I went back and read the book, and I was like, "There's no way. How did this happen?" And it again is the one book that got me, and that's why today this is my favorite book. So I say that I've read that book. If you give me a good book, I'll read it. But otherwise, I do not like reading. I do not like writing. That is the last thing on my mind. So when I saw this in my catalog for what it was going to be my classes, I was like, there's no way. No, I'm not going to be able to do this. I'm not going to pass my classes because I already struggled through that in high school. And in high school, with being homeschooled and my mom being there, we had the ability to kind of flex a little bit, and they'd be like, okay, we're going to add a little bit of extension on when this book report's being written or this essay or this research paper. We're going to, we can do that. In college, you can't do that. Okay. The teacher says, this is the due date. You got to have it done by this date. You got to have it. And even to this day, I still struggle with this, but back then especially, I was a procrastinator. I waited to the last second to write anything or do anything because, again, I hated writing and reading. So with that, I was like, there's no way. So they were like, well, I mean, you're here. We've already paid for you to show up at least a semester. Let's see if there's not another major that you would be interested in. So we started flipping through the catalog. And then we came across broadcasting and media production. Now, these were two separate majors at the time, by the way. These were two separate majors. But Mom was like, well, you've been in radio, you've been working at the radio station for a while. What about this? And I thought, I could probably get into radio. I like doing that. I like, hanging out and, playing video games, but I like hanging out and doing the radio stuff. I loved, the idea of being on the air because, as you already know, as I said in the first episode of this podcast, I'm a talker and I will talk your ear off like there's no tomorrow. So there's that. But nonetheless, here we are, we're at college and I'm like, okay, well, I got to pick a major. So I was like, all right, I'll pick broadcasting. So long story short, switched my majors, started broadcasting. And as a side note, I'm going to get back to this because this is going to become important. When I went to do my work, by the way, because I had been working at the radio station, right? Well, Pensacola Christian College, they also have a radio station there called Rejoice Radio. And I was very much interested while I was there. I wanted that to be my work job, to be able to work there. And so I applied for it. I put it in, and they had already been working on putting in students to work there, I guess the year that I was showing up. But because it was my freshman year, they didn't really want to pull anybody other than some upperclassmen, students that had already been in broadcasting for that first year to see how it would go. So I ended up having to work grounds, and then I ended up working, because again, like I said, Abeka Books is out of the same group. So they had what was called a distribution center where all the books came in after they went through the printing press because they had their own printers, they had all that stuff. Anyway, so I had to work there for my freshman year. So, but I was still interested in working there. So jumping forward now to my sophomore year, I was able to work there. I started working at the Rejoice Radio, and I ended up working there actually from my sophomore year all the way through until my fifth year there, which I'm going to explain that in a second. I was there for 5 years, and so from my second year through my fifth year, that's where I worked. With the exception of one interterm and one summer, I worked there every summer and every semester. So in fact, when I went to Pensacola after starting my sophomore year, I didn't come home except for 3 weeks out of the year. 1 week during the summer and 2 weeks during Christmas. Otherwise, I was there the rest of the time in Pensacola. That's where I lived for 4 years, really. I lived there at the dorms. That was my life for 4 years. But let me cut back here real quick, and I'm gonna sum this up, because college, there was, oh my goodness, I could spend a whole nother episode just on my time in college, just the experience and stuff. But I'm gonna summarize it very quickly, and maybe at a later date when we get into some other topics that may deal specifically with something that happened while I was at college, I may go and tell more details about that. But I started off as broadcasting, and again, laziness, procrastination. Second semester freshman year, I had a D in my class. In my only broadcasting major class, I had a D in it. I go to my sophomore year, I take classes my sophomore year, and I struggled with some of those. I had one F and a few other things. Again, academically, I struggled in college. Now, that being said, I will submit the fact, and other people will agree with me and will tell you, Pensacola is academically tough. I could have gone to a state college, taken the exact same courses, and probably could have walked away with A's and B's. But instead, I was walking away with C's, D's, and F's, because their grading system is a lot more difficult. And especially before they got accredited, they were definitely a lot more difficult than any other place. When they got accredited, some of it softened up a little bit, but for the most part, they're still very academically tough, even today, and stuff. So when I say that I struggled, it was because, I'm not by my own self academically great, but at the same time, even when I do push myself and do stuff, it was not an easy place to get an education. It wasn't. But it was good education, nonetheless, what I was learning. So my sophomore year, I struggled. Well, left, came home for my 2 weeks, right, for Christmas. Went back the first week of January, and I worked interterm there. So I was working interterm. Which interterm, if you don't know, if you're high school or if you're in, middle school, whatever, maybe you're younger than college age and you're listening to this podcast, which, by the way, I highly encourage, if you're listening to this and you've got some younger folks, this podcast is really meant for those that are in Gen Z and Gen Alpha. That's who our primary target is, to try to talk to you guys, because we want to help you as you're growing older and as you're growing into these different situations. We want to be able to help you. So that's our primary audience there for the most part. But again, anybody, any age. But I was going to interterm, which is basically the 2 weeks where you could take a full class if you wanted to, a full semester class in 2 weeks. So your first week, by the end of the first week, you're taking your midterm, and by the end of the second week, you're taking your finals. But it is a solid all the way through, just the necessary, everything for that class, and it's one class. But you could also go and work, and so that's what I was doing. So I was there working at the radio station there. At the end of the week, on that Saturday, we had to go and do our orientation again for all the workers at the end of the second week. So we're there. We finished that, and I go to register to go register for my classes, and I was immediately given a note saying I needed to go see registrar. So I show up to registrar, and they tell me, yes, so your major is no longer existing. It has been dropped. And I said, excuse me? And they said, yes, your major no longer exists. With the accreditation process that's going on at this moment, we have to have a dean that has a master's level in that field be the dean over that in order to be able to have the major for the thing. Now, a lot of what I just said there, I found out over the course of the next couple of weeks and months. But basically, they told me the major had dropped that day, and I had to pick a new major. And I said, I don't know what other major I want to do. I'm not going to be an education teacher. I already went down that road. I said, I'm not doing the reading and writing. And then, I'm broadcasting. That's what I want to do. And I was really getting into it, even though I was struggling in classes and I was going to have to take a few classes again. I was struggling. But I remember just a few minutes ago, I mentioned I made a D in that freshman class. Well, all the freshmen who had come in, they told them, yeah, the major's done. We're not continuing the major. You cannot continue. They did, however, say, because our dean who was over that had left, and I'm not going to go into that story. That's not the point. But he had left. And so when he left, there was 2 other teachers that were underneath him. Neither one of them had their masters in it, but they were able to teach the classes. So they said, okay, we're going to let the juniors and the seniors move on, but not the sophomores as well. But then we're like, well, the sophomore, we just got through taking literally 4 out of the 6 courses that I had in my fall semester were all broadcasting majors. Or like all broadcasting major classes. So we're like, we just took 4 classes all in one semester. We've already really delved into this. So they changed it and they said, okay, well, those of you, you can go through. But I couldn't because of a freshman level class that was no longer going to be done. I could no longer go back and take that class. And since it has a D, in order to graduate, you have to have at least a C- in any and all of your major classes. So no matter what happened, I was going to have to change my major. So I did, and I changed my major, and that spring semester I went undeclared. They allowed us to go undeclared for that semester because they figured, okay, this was kind of sudden. If you wanted to go undeclared that semester, work maybe on your minor and some general electives, you could do that. So I went with history, and I added in some Bible. So I took 3 history classes and 2 Bible classes that semester. Just got through that semester, went through the summer, and was like, okay, now what am I going to do? So for that entire year, I was just struggling. By the way, that semester was one of my worst semesters. In fact, it was the second worst semester I ever had in college. For those of you that are about to gasp, I apologize, but ahead of time. But I had a .37 GPA for that semester. It was awful because I felt like God, what are you doing? I don't have. What am I supposed to do? Like, this was what I was supposed to do. You literally ripped the floor out from underneath of me. I am free falling now into something that I don't know where I'm going, and I don't even know what you now want me to do. Like, this is what I was supposed to do. Now, I grant you all the decisions and all the things that have been happening up to this point have been my fault. I have not pushed myself and I didn't go see teachers. I didn't do things. So yes, the ultimate result of all this is my fault. And I totally look back at that and realize that and know that. But even at that time, I was like, okay, so it's my fault. But now what? I gotta do something. I can't just not do anything. Like, I mean, that would be the worst decision possible. So God, what am I supposed to do? What am I doing? So it took that entire semester and going into probably into mid-August when I finally came home since Christmas. I came home for 1 week in August, and that was when I was like, okay, God, you got to give me an answer. I'm about to go back. So my dad sat me down, and we had a long discussion, and the short of it is, he was like, well, you want to run a radio station, right? You need to know how to run it. It's not like, you could show up and know how to do everything, but if you don't know how to run a business, what do you do? So I agreed to go back and become a business management major. So in my 3rd year, I'm now retaking freshman level classes. And so I'm starting basically over again. Long story short, through that, I went through 3 years of that. And then I ended up leaving. Now, all the meanwhile, while all this is happening, I'm going to get into another personal side of my story as well. And remember, still influencing by the pornography and everything else was going on behind the scenes, okay? Because this was all happening at the same time. During my college years, during my 5 years there, I would officially say 2 girlfriends, but I guess you could add a 3rd person we were interested in each other, but it didn't last very long. So I won't include her in that because that really wasn't something that we really were pursuing. But my first girlfriend that I had was from my freshman year, and in this setting, I may not go into details. Maybe in a certain setting where I'm not. This is not a recording, but a personal topic I may talk about. But the first girlfriend was not a good situation. Okay. She and I, we were, how do I say this? We were in it for all the wrong reasons. I'll put it that way. And it only lasted over Christmas break. So in a roundabout way, you could say that really wasn't a boyfriend-girlfriend situation. But again, it was all for the wrong reasons. And thankfully, through some very important people in my life, they were like, look, you just need to drop her and just leave her. She is not the girl for you. And I'm glad I did, because I look back, not to go into much details, but needless to say, I was number 2 out of 8 people that she ended up dating over the course of the next 2 years. And a lot of things happened there, and it was not good. So God protected me from that there. But then there was another girl that I met, and I won't mention names in this case because there's no need for that. But there was another girl that I met, and I guess in a roundabout way, this testimony has also turned into a slight apology. But there were some things that I, for a year and a half we did together that I look back and regret. And it was not, again, all for the wrong reasons, but it was because of me. And I was not in the right mindset. I was not being very spiritually minded about everything, and I wasn't looking for the future. I was looking for the here and now. And also, from a certain standpoint, it was also a social thing, too. Like, I don't know if it's the same way today with Gen Z or Gen Alpha, but for millennials, at least for us, or at least at that college, having you dating the opposite, sex there, whether it was, a guy dating a girl, girl dating a guy, it was a social thing. Because it was like, being single was kind of the outcast, being, a couple was like, oh yeah, we're in the in crowd, we're hanging out with all the other couples, it was, that was the thing. And so part of it, the reason why we probably dated for so long was, at least from my point of view, was that. But then again, all the other things that were going on, it was not right. And so in that case, this was the opposite. She needed to get away from me because I was not the right person for her. And thankfully, the Lord worked that out in such a way, and she was able to move on. And I now know she's very happily married and whatnot. And I'm glad of that. But now we move into my 20s. Okay, so I'm already in my 20s now. I finished college. I leave at the age of 23, Pensacola, having not graduated. I have 2 majors, one of which is barely a sophomore level and another that is at a junior level course. And so I left. Academic probation was the main reason because, again, my last semester there was terrible. It was even worse than the other one. And I was just like, I'm done. Like mentally, physically, college, I'm done. I want to move on and get into things that I felt like God was calling me to do. And I kind of got to wrap this up here real quick because I'm looking at my time and realize that I'm running out of time here. So and like I said, I could spend a lot of time on college. That was really kind of I feel like the focal point of how everything kind of started turning around. But long story short is, again, my 20s, I literally go back to, when I left college, I literally go back to the very job that I had the summer before I left to go to college. So I was like, I just made a full 180 degree or 360 degree, however you want to look at it. I made a full turn. I'm right back to where I started again. So God, what in the world's going on? What I have done wrong. I have sinned. I've done all that. But God, what is happening? Why am I back? I thought that after all this, that I was going to move forward. Now, at the time, that's what I thought. I look back at it now and I realize God was like, all right, yeah, you should have done better. Yeah, you sinned. You should have listened, but I'm going to teach you some more lessons here before we move you forward. All right. And I'm going to teach you some hard lessons. So I was working that job and there was a lot of, I'm not even going to go into the things that were going on at that job. But it was a lot. And the short of it is that through those things, God was able to lead me and really teach me the early stages of what I still struggle to today is patience. And by the way, if you struggle with patience, I want to encourage you, one, don't ask God for patience or to learn patience, because I'm going to tell you, He going to give it to you, and He going to give it to you a lot, okay? But at the same time, though, be humble about it and learn patience because God will work through you in much more better ways having patience than not. And that was the one thing that I was failing when I was working there. And I finally, after 6 months of working there, I was like, all right, God, you know what? If this has to be my job for the rest of my life, fine. I will suck it up. I will get up every morning. I will go to work. I'll work my 10-hour shifts. I'll go home and I'll do it again every single day, no matter how long it takes, until I finally die at a ripe old age of 127, whatever. I don't care. I'll do it. If this is what you've got me in and this is what you want me to do, then I'll do it. If this is not, then Lord, you're going to have to open up the doors. You're going to have to do something, but I will do this for the rest of my life if this is the only door that opens. I'm not kidding. I prayed that prayer. And by the way, that is a quote. I remember those words because it was not a day later. In fact, I think it was that afternoon. I prayed that while I was at work. That afternoon, I find out from my dad that there was a possibility that I might be able to go back and work at the radio station that I worked back in high school at. Short story of that, about 5 months later, that actually became true. And without going into much details about that, because there was a lot that was involved in that, I ended up going back and I was the only one. The other people that were working there, they left and I showed up. And I still, by the way, am working 2 weeks at my other job. And for 2 weeks after I got off of that job, I would show up at the radio station and work over there. And so I was doing 2 jobs at once for that. And then when I finally was able to leave the other job, that's when I went in there full-fledged and I started working for the church and for the radio station there at the church again, where it all kind of started. So in a roundabout way, I kind of did make a 360-degree turn where, college was the middle of it. And I started in high school. I went to this one job. I went to college. I went back to that job. And then now I'm back at the radio station. And for 4.5 years, God blessed and was able to allow me to work at that radio station. And it was I walked in thinking, okay, everything I learned at Rejoice, everything, I've got this. And then I showed up, and for 4.5 years, I learned almost every single day. I didn't know everything, and I was still learning, and it was incredible. But I will never regret all the decisions that I made while I was there, because the things that I was learning at the radio station and was able to then turn around. And then now, after those 4.5 years, I left there and I started with my dad's ministry, Truth and Love Radio Network. And for the last now 4.5 years, almost 5 years now, having worked, in fact, actually, by the time this airs, it will have been 5 years since we really started working on this. Now, the radio station itself didn't start up until about 4 years ago now, but so for about a year, it took about a year to put everything together. But for 5 years now, God has been able to use what I learned in those situations to be able to now apply into now. Now, I did say, before, and this is kind of my conclusion to kind of round back out again. So all of this is happening. And remember, I said all the way back now, 30, 40 minutes ago in this podcast, I made mention about the fact that I had struggled and I had continued to struggle with pornography. What ended up stopping that is a couple of different things. One of which is I got accountability. And by the way, if you're somebody who struggles with that or any other sort of addictions, let me tell you, you want an accountability partner. And yes, it takes time. It takes a lot of time. But through the grace of God, you wake up every day and you pray, God, this is a new day. And I know Satan is after me. He's after my soul. He's after my heart. He's after everything that I truly actually stand for, which is you. And I'm going to need your help today. And and I also include this in my prayers. When temptation shows up, it's not an if, it is a when. It's going to happen. When it shows up, God, I need you to be standing there right next to me saying, it's okay. We're going to walk away from this. And it's going to be okay. That's what I need every day. And I have to pray that almost every day now to be able to get through that. Thank God I have been away from that for several years now. And for several years, I just want to say for all of those that are dealing with this, the reason why a lot of the situations that I have ended up in and why life has turned the way it has been and not been so full-fledged straightforward and has been more of janky little time sections in my mind that I've been through, it's because of this. Do I believe that God had somebody for me? Probably. Do I believe that God still has somebody for me? Probably. But like Trey said in his testimony, he made something, I don't want to reference his completely because, again, that's his testimony. But he did say, he worried about the fact that God was going to have somebody for him. I did too, and I still do. And if God does have somebody for me, or maybe he has somebody for you, you've got to be in the right heart and the right mind and the right mindset to be prepared for that. You can't just be living life however you want and then expect it to happen from God. If you want God to open that door, you've got to be able to get rid of your addiction. So whether it's, and I'm gonna be real with you on this one too. If you do drugs or if you do alcohol to the point where it is an addiction and it is a severe problem, situations like that are going to lead to where God's not going to bless that. And he's not going to open the doors for a situation where you're only going to cause it and make things worse, especially as a man. If you're a man, you are going to end up becoming the spiritual leader of your home. And if you are not in the right mindset, whether again, drugs, alcohol, pornography, whatever it is, if you're not in the right mindset, you're not going to be able to be the spiritual leader that you need to be in your home. So I want to encourage those of you that are adults that are struggling through this. I want to encourage you, get yourself an accountability partner. For those of you that may be listening and are teenagers and are listening to this, and maybe you already are struggling through this, get an accountability partner. Maybe that's your youth pastor. Maybe that's your parents. Maybe that's the pastor. Maybe that is another adult that is spiritually involved in your life. Whoever that might be, get involved in that. It is well worth it. And like in everything, no matter what your sin is and whatever you're dealing with, the truth is Satan's going to make it every sin feel like it feels good. It's what it should be. But in truth and in reality of it, it's only going to last for a short time. And then afterwards, the feeling that you get afterwards where it's like, man, I feel awful. It is 100 times worse than whatever the feeling of good that you felt. And that's how he traps you. And that's how you get you. But then he just keeps kind of reminding you, hey, well, you felt good for that time. If you keep it up, then you can just constantly stay good. No, that's not how that works either. Because it only then amplifies the bad feelings that you have afterwards. So my testimony is pretty simple, okay? It's the grace of God. It's the mercy of God that I'm still alive and that I'm still here and I'm still doing things. And whether, and as I mentioned about whether God has a helpmeet for me, whether he has a nice young lady out there that he has for me or not. At this point, in my mind, as a single guy, it does not bother me. If he does, then God's going to prepare me. He's going to put me in the right position to be able to handle that. And when that happens, she and I are going to have, as best as I can describe it, the best marriage possible. Because we're gonna follow God, we're gonna listen to him. Now, does that mean that doesn't come with troubles? No. Ask any person who's married. There are troubles in marriage, but it does not mean that you can't work them through or work them out. But as single people, though, is there still somebody out there? Probably. But in the meantime, I want to encourage you to follow in the steps of like Paul. Does it mean that you shouldn't be looking? No, you should. But in the meantime, while you're doing that, while that is an active thing that you're doing, while you're looking for the person that God has for you, you also have to have the mindset that because you are single and God has put you in that position, your whole focus should be on him and the ministry of what he has called you to do. Now, that ministry can be whatever it is, okay? It could be as simple as maybe you're a teenager and, you are helping out after school with, community service, or you're helping out at a retirement home, or you are helping out around your church, or, something that is God has called you to do at that time in your life, whatever that may be. Maybe as an adult, it's the job you're working. You could be working at a factory. Well, how is God going to use me at a factory? Well, you show up every day, put a smile on your face, and preach Jesus. Pretty simple. And let God have the results. So again, like I said, my testimony is pretty simple. It is the grace and mercy of God throughout all of my entire life that even in spite of what I've done wrong, he has been merciful, he has been gracious, and he has been faithful is the biggest word I want to use. I haven't used that word in this entire podcast, and on purpose until this very moment. He has been faithful in everything, and he will always be faithful in everything because he is God. He is the truth. He is the way, the truth, and the life, and no man come unto the Father but by me, which is Jesus Christ. And it is the faithfulness of God that we can sit here today and have joy, have peace, and comfort knowing that God's in control and that our entire life is just from one day to the next, if we trust in him and we follow him, is just being orchestrated in such a beautiful way that when we can get to the end of life and look back, we'll be able to say, wow, God did some amazing things in my life. At those moments, I'm looking like, man, what are you doing? Like I said when I was in college, like, what are you doing, God? You dropped my major? Like, what's going on? But I look back at it, it was just him moving me to the next step. So no matter where you are in life, spiritually or even in age, God is still orchestrating your life. Trust him, lean on him, and whatever you do, obey his commandments and follow him. It is the best thing that you can do in your life. So with that is my testimony. I hope that you take that and understand that we've been through some things ourselves. Both of us have. And we've seen a thing or two, as the one commercial says. But we hope that through this podcast, as you listen through the episodes, as we go over topic after topic, I want you to understand that we're just like anybody else. We've made mistakes. We're sinners, but God can still use us. And because he can use us, he can use you in wherever you're at. So that's the reason why we wanted to do these testimonies to start off with. It's not because we wanted to tell you about our lives, nor did we want to tell you about, all of our wrongdoings and how terrible, rotten people that we are, or in some cases, how, if you want to look at it from a certain point of view, how good we are. We're perfect. No, we're not perfect. But the point is that we wanted you to know who we are, so that before you sat there and says, well, how can they understand or how can they know? Well, we may not know the details. Again, everybody's different. We don't live in your shoes, but we at least know from God's word, God does know. And because he knows, and because his word is always true, we can go to his word and be like, well, this is what God says about this. So if we're not going through it, somebody else out there, maybe even you, is going through this. And let's talk about it. Let's figure this out on how we can make this better, whatever it is. But that's our testimonies. That's what we came here to do. And I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you so much for listening this entire time. I know it was long, and I know Trey's was long. I hope you were able to listen to the whole thing, at least at some point, maybe not all in one sitting, but hopefully at some point you've listened to the whole thing, and appreciate you, our listeners. We appreciate everything about you, and we hope that we'll catch you again in the next episode, which the next episode is going to be on the future So I kind of touched on it a little bit here. I know Trey did a little bit in his testimony. We're going to really get into that in this next episode about worrying about the future. What is that going to be? So we're going to talk more about that in the next episode. Hope to catch you then. In the meantime, this has been Truth Over the Noise, and my name is Nathan Woltmann, the director of TIL Radio Network. For more information about Truth Over the Noise podcast, go to truthoverthenoise.com or tilradio.org. You can find more information there, and this has been a production of Truth Over the Noise podcast and TIL Radio Network.